Okay,
Um,
that works.
So we have an opportunity to have a conversation with you in the audience. But while I'm pulling those chairs out, I was kind of curious to see by a show of hands, and I hope that I'm loud enough for everybody. You know, there are lots of different organizations that promote professional awareness of things like film and video, conservation of art and so forth. I was sort of curious what membership groups you belong to. So I was wondering if you would raise your hand if you're a member of AIC. Okay, so there's a lot of AIC folks here. How about AMIA, Association of Moving Image Archivists? Right, just about maybe a quarter. Let's see, Association of Recorded Sound Collections. Anybody in here? Megan, good for you. Let's see.
How about SMPTE?
SMPTE, Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. Let's see. What international organizations are there for film and video or AIC conservation? How about this? Society of American Archivists. Got a couple people from those groups. ALA Preservation, American Library Association Preservation. So it just seems to me that we don't have a lot of overlap in this area. I'm sure I'm missing some very, very important group that gets together. Who went to the Orphans Film Symposium 2 weeks ago? 1, 2, you didn't get to go. So one thing. Huh? Right. Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask about, FIAF, which is the International Film.
They're in China now.
And in China now, okay.
That's organization. They're going through membership.
Right, it's organizational only.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you go to learn? Let's have the speakers coming up, and we'll get some microphones. Nobody wants to sit in chairs?
No chairs. We're being informal.
Good.
I'm here.
So I really do want to open this up to the audience, and it does not appear to be on. You're working on it. I'll just project with my speaker's voice. Yes, Andrew.
I have a technical question for Janice. We were talking yesterday about limiting factors with film stock and things like that. With your printer, how long can that printer, it seems really critical to you, so how long can you make that printer work? Are there cards or other kinds of
They're still making it. There's the 7700 model. It's the latest model. LOC has a brand new one. UCLA has a brand new one. There's no problem there.
So from a maintenance card, like cards or other things, how often do you have to change things? Or
The electronics are a much larger problem than the mechanical end of it. And the older machines they don't support anymore, but they will revamp your machine. So they'll take a machine from the 80s and put new electronics in it for a mere $50,000 or whatever, So.
That seems fairly viable.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
But it seems very critical. If you don't have that, you're stuck.
Yeah. Although, there's other machines that do what that does,
You have it's only dry, but
Well, we have 3 of those, actually. 2 are wet, and 1 is dry. So, and, so you get multiples for spare parts. And
Question back here? Somebody have a question back here? Okay, run over to Nora.
Hi, I'm sorry, I've been suffering from a cold this week. A few people mentioned the human factor in a number of ways, tampering, as well as Ross pointing out the hubbub, basically, and dwell time. And I've seen a mix of things, and I've been observing as we walk past here in the black box galleries. I'm finding such an interesting mix of conservators and restorers coming into the curatorial dialogue. So I'm really interested in the fact that nobody mentioned is dwell time and control of people coming in and out of galleries. And whether, I mean, we've all seen various presentations that here right outside, there's simply a panel saying the name of the artist. There's not a loop time, or, well, actually, there is one right outside. Ignore that. But you don't want to put up a lot of barriers. But are there some in your experience where you've had a limited number of people accessing a black box installation? And I've seen this in other time-based media art.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, but I can speak at the Hirshhorn. Sometimes our curators do decide that it's no business of the public to know how long something is that is looped. So I'll know, and I'm told not to tell anyone, even if they ask. Which, yeah, and Jeff and I are like the only people that will know how long something actually is. And I've been stopped by visitors to ask how long they should be sitting in the gallery, and I kind of feel like a jerk because I'm like, well, as long as you think you should. I don't know if that was kind of answering what you were asking. Oh.
I mean, one thing, if you can read really quickly, you read Ross's agreement in which you specify screening times. No, I know. But I was just going to say that Michael Snow and Wavelength, if it's going into gallery or museum collections, it is only shown with specified start and finish times on a schedule, because otherwise it makes no sense. And I think that, artists do give that consideration and give guidance to museums in that way. I think, although if you are smart enough, Wavelength doesn't make any sense if you just sort of step in and out. But I think artists have been giving guidance in that area as well.
I think it really depends on the work as well. At Tate, we always put the duration on the wall label, but it depends on the artist as to whether they want there to be a strict start time and a strict sort of finish time. There are some artists who aren't necessarily film artists who do want you to go in and sit through the entire duration. But in most museums, it's just very impractical for that to happen. I mean, I've seen like Matthew Barney at SF MoMA, and you could only go in at the beginning of the film. You were allowed to leave during the film, but you could only go in at the very beginning, and Steve McQueen's definitely done that as well. We do have a few works where there is, it states the duration on the outside, and if the artist has made something that's kind of a convenient thing that fits into an hour, so it's like 20 minutes long or something like that, they have sort of said it's 20 minutes long, and then so it starts on the hour or on the half hour. So if it's like 27 minutes long, we have some artists where they put like 3 minutes of black in, and then when you have a countdown on the screen, and then you know that you can go in. But certainly at the Tate, the practicalities of saying you cannot go in while this is running, unless it's a performance that's done in the evening in the cinema, in our sort of theatre setup, that's totally different. But when it's installed in the gallery, it's just not going to work.
I would have a question for Ross. When in a gallery, it's often not possible to show the film as actual film, but to show it as a digital projection. Could you talk a bit about like what would be the parameters for that, or what would be good parameters? Not to show it on the DVD, for example. What would be the main characteristical differences?
Yeah, well, that's a complicated question. I think the first thing I would say in general is that I have pretty much no rules except that I usually let the work determine what the answers will be. So what is the answer for one work will not be the answer for another. They each have their own, especially when you're dealing with artist cinema of any flavor. There's so many different varieties. Some work can make that transformation to digital with no trouble. Others are more problematic. I mean, I think that, for example, with that Phil Solomon piece, I really do think the meaning is substantially transformed if you're taking a work that's about organic decay and translating it into zeros and ones at a philosophical level. You just have to ask what that means. Aesthetically, obviously there are two different technologies, well, not even just two. In film, you've got a certain number of formats and film stocks. In digital, the flavors are endless. I mean, there's just so many different, the digital technology is changing all the time, depending on if you're talking about digital originated works, then you've got all sorts of, different types of cameras that have different types of capture. But what you're talking about translating specifically film originated works and then doing a digital remastering for digital presentation, you can actually get surprisingly good results even for works that are about light. I mean, what I would say is that the light can be substantially transformed, and so an interpretive act is needed. I really couldn't even begin to lay down principles without having a specific case study, because each one would have different parameters. I mean, I almost never find myself doing the same thing twice. Maybe 6 years later, I'll wind up echoing something I did on another project, and you kind of always pull from what you did before. But a lot of it has to do with the quality of the remastering, and you have to, of course, have controlled conditions when you're doing your digital remastering as well. If you're just sitting there with your Macintosh in a room with a lot of other things going on, and well, you want to have controlled lighting conditions when you're doing your digital remastering, and that can be anywhere from a projected image in a complete black box environment, I've done that, or to a semi-darkened, telecine studio, or working all the way on down. But you have to consider all those things, and then once you transcode the file, let's suppose that you've transferred to, let's say, 2K. Most museums won't be able to do 4K like we did for Samuel Beckett's film. But in the near future, I think 2K will be realistic. You might do your transfer at 2K. This is a very realistic workflow that you might wind up encountering. You scan at 2K, then they will down-res to HD for your presentation. But your data would still be starting in a 2K environment. Let's say that you do everything possible to maintain the quality in your controlled environment when you're doing your remastering. Then you get into this issue of transcoding for different access issues, and then the nightmares begin. Because once you've left the comfort of this controlled environment, it's chaos out there. It's the Wild West in terms of exhibition conditions. And you could have a whole week-long seminar just on that. I don't know how to guide you except to say that you'd have to look at what your circumstances are and then let the work determine it. If this is a work that's about light, you're going to have to work really hard to get it right, and you still might have to settle for a reinterpretation. Ideally, what I do now for my current projects is I would try, when I can, I advocate to have budgets for both so that I can both digitally remaster and make analog film. Certainly from a preservation standpoint, film is still superior. There's really, once you get into it, from a preservation issue, you really do need to go out to film for film-originated works. But for viewing, I do think it makes sense to have digital data, but then you have to basically do the same project multiple times. I mean, what's the current phrase going around? The post-medium artist, is that Rosalind Krauss? Somebody. I mean, I've met people at parties who describe themselves as post-medium artists, and they are literally making works that transfer to different, even in my own filmmaking currently, I have to be ready to master to 4 different forms. It's just so ironic for me, who's so invested in medium specificity, that I have to make 5 different iterations. Anyway, I could go on and on, so you better just stop me. But
I just wanted to add something to that, because I appreciate Ross saying that it's a case-by-case basis, and we just saw an excellent presentation today on loopers and how to make loopers, and of course just because work is shown in a gallery setting does not mean that it can't be shown on film. You know, and it really is important, I think, to decide with the artist, or, you know, make a sort of case-by-case determination, because it really does change the work.
Ross, I have a question for you. In your demo between the analog and the digital version, there's no doubt the digital was not as sharp, right?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you were to look at it with a, I still prefer the analog in that, particularly in that.
I think there's much more detail like you were saying, watch the faces and the detail. It was like, it was real crisp.
Yeah, we did improve it further, but I would still say that in the perfect world,
what kind of a scan was that? Was that a 4K?
That was an ARRI scan, but one issue that, talk about scanning, this is a whole nother, you could do hours, days just on scanning. But I mean, one issue, even beyond the resolution, because realistically, you know, the industry moves up all the time, so they're now at 8K, and, you know, 4K is not even considered good enough in some circles. That can keep on going. So I don't know that they've tapped out the bottom of film yet. But the other big issue for scanning is dynamic range. That is even a much bigger issue for me than the resolution, because, you know, maybe a trained eye like yourself can really see the resolution, but what I'm really focusing on when I look at that demonstration more is the tonal range. We worked really hard to get that tonal range. The earlier tests were not to that level, and even here you still feel a gap. Most scanners that are available on the market today, if you take the Herter and Driffield curve for them, they will not capture the full tonal range that a film can capture. They'll capture a large section of it, but just as in digital still photography, you've got what's called HDR, high dynamic range photography, which they actually take a series of, I think it's 3 images traditionally, and then they composite them to create the full tonal range. Some places will do multi-pass scanning, and others are working to develop scanners that will actually encompass the full latitude of the film. But most on the market aren't doing that yet, and so this is a real issue that you might have what looks like a very nice sharp image, but you won't get the full tonal range. The worst place that you can see this, in an analogous thing, I think, it's a little bit apples and oranges, but if you take digitally originated works, unless they're with a very good digital camera, you're going to have no highlight details. If you have a nice bright exterior, it's like white. There's nothing there. Whereas if you take a film originated work, you will have a really nice gradation of images from deep shadow to detail in the specular highlights.
And that's the advantage of film, the dynamic range, even in acquisition, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, yes, to be fair, I mean, I'm only learning this myself, to be honest.
Okay.
Everyone in our field is. I really don't know too many people who can legitimately call themselves an expert, and very few know both film and digital. I find many people who are digital experts and many film, and almost no one knows both, very few. And, so anyway, I'm just dabbling, I'm just learning like everyone else, but I have seen definite improvement in these exact areas in some of the digital cameras that are coming out. So depending on what camera you use, you've got a lot of different flavors, and they each have something to offer. And so the curve is improving.
And what res was that scanned at, that particular?
That was at 4K.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a question in the back, and we want to definitely make sure that at least everybody gets a chance to start their question, and then we can all find each other with a drink in hand in another 10 minutes or so and follow up on it. So go ahead.
Yes, thanks. Thank you all for your presentations. I still have lots to learn on the technical side, so I really filled my notebooks over the past 2 days, so thank you very much. I've had in mind a film installation. I'm curious to see what kind of advice you would have. It's a film installation, 35 millimeters, and it's basically a white room, and the film itself is a series of 50 different light fixtures. So it's a series of stills, and the whole point of the work is for the visitor to see how the color and the light in the room, in the white room, changes as from light fixtures to light fixtures. So my question is, do you have any advice in terms of equipment selection and documenting the quality of the light for each image?
35 mil in the gallery. That's, I mean, yeah, I can't tell you about the projection equipment, but obviously you'd have to be thinking about all these issues that attended, like the color temperature of the bulbs. If you're talking about light, you know, you're talking about a replication or a representation of what that light would be. You can't actually emulate the tungsten filament or the light of the lights that you're talking about, but you're talking about a replication of it. So that's a complex question.
And I think you may find that you also want to look at different screen materials, because that seems to be the sort of obvious choice, especially when dealing with the white cube, because quite often with different pearlescent screens you can already achieve quite good effects without doing too much on the equipment side.
Yeah, it's actually projected on a whole wall, one of the 4 walls in the room, so directly onto the wall.
But I think a good screen with a good reflection is going to resolve quite a lot, and you can inbuild them quite neatly. But I think just a flat wall may not do it in that case.
Oh, screen paint, sure. That's the whole, yeah. Yes,
Yeah,
yes, yes.
But quite often those Roscoe paints really aren't what they're promising, and a good pearlescent screen material is still a world apart from that.
Right, yeah, that's what we use. Yeah.
Testing, do a lot of testing.
Right.
I sort of have a reverse question for the conservators here, because I think the common thread that I saw throughout the 2 days is subjectivity. And I'm wondering how each of the conservators deal with the with subjectivity and making the decision with it.
I just trust the eyes, and the older they are, the better they are. Because
well, living artists are helpful. You can work directly with them. It makes a big, big difference. With Smithson, there's actually a lot of color changes that we had to make for that piece. A lot of them were faded. There were magenta marks, and a lot of them that had to be taken out. And that the direction from the estate was that they should look natural. So we've worked with them on and off, and it's totally subjective, and you strive to do your best, I think, and you share it with as many people as you can. I think it's good to have multiple people look at it, because they'll see something differently. I don't have an answer.
Can you elaborate a bit more?
Well, we're as conservators, you're challenged with the concept of subjectivity, that there are many choices to conserve something, how it's preserved, changing materials, changing methodologies, and you're tasked with the decision of saying this is the right thing or good enough. What is your philosophy with that?
If the artist is around, you talk to them as much as possible and you document that. So in the future, there's some reference for people to go back to. So although you have to deal with those grey areas, we're quite lucky because quite a lot of our artists are still around. So we really try to talk to them as much as possible. So if we do an install of their work, if they can't come over, we send them all the drawings, or we send them the test prints, or maybe they will come over, and then we get their reaction to that as well. Because, yeah, it's a really big problem.
And if they're not allowed?
Yeah, then there's experts out there. You know, there's people who know their work, or they've seen it, so you call people and you're like, did you see that work? But, you know, colour memory and all of that stuff is really problematic. So, yeah, you get into that whole world of, you know, recreating a work. But when you're dealing with an installation in the gallery, it's going to be different every single time you install it anyway. So you know that it can never be exactly the same. So I think for me, one of the critical things is what can change and what can't change as well, and trying to understand that.
Excuse me, as a conservator sitting in the audience, I just want to support what was just said, and that is document, document, document. And even though we know in a different environment, a different milieu, it may look a little differently, what happens in our documentation is people can go back, or the person who succeeds me, comes after me in 10 years or 20 years, can look and not just get the technical aspect of my documentation, but the reasoning behind it. And I think that's can be a big issue. Why do we make the choices we do?
And actually, I just want to go back to what Tina said. It would also be talking to you and to Janice, and finding out, because if there's some document of like the technical, the film, or maybe how it was made, if we can sort of have that sort of production history, then we can also talk to you guys, because then you know the material and you can have a sense of what it may have looked like or have an opinion there. So I think talking to the technical experts is really critical as well to help with that.
And having a good reference original is always nice. That's the best thing. We always ask for an original. Do you have something that is approved the way you want it to be? That's the most important thing. And often they do, and often they're not very good, actually.
Yeah.
And we can do much better, but...
As this has shown these last 2 days, just looking at this material really carefully and really understanding the material helps you a lot. You learn, you see things differently than you did originally because you really understand it better. So it's a learning process.
I brought up Gone with the Wind yesterday. Gone with the Wind had a very distinct look. Technicolor prints, they still exist from 1939. And when they did one of the restorations, they didn't make it look anything like it. Nothing like it. They said make it normal. The film wasn't designed to be normal.
I just wanted to add one more thing. Within the acquisition process, you might face yourself with the situation that you ideally deal with an artwork with the artist still alive, and you can go back to the artist and can consult with him and revisit what needs to be done. You can face the situation that the artist is not available anymore, but you can also face the situation that you are dealing with gifts that have been given to an institution, and you kind of past that point yet that you can go back and ask what should have been given to the institution, or it's adding way more levels to make this happen, and it's much, much more complicated. I don't want to add another level of frustration here, but I just want to mention it to be accurate. And a lot of complicated artworks actually ended up being gifts to institutions, and institutions have to deal with it.
That's the same thing with the film as well. If you don't adopt these of the original material you're getting, you don't know always what you're doing with the genes and that what was close to the original that you have. And how many other versions helps it out. It's very complicated.
I mean, even a film like Daughters of the Dust, the DP wanted it a certain way. Someday all these prints are going to be faded, and there's really no record. In 100 years, no one's going to know, that it was really supposed to look
They'll
like
know
what you
today
just...
because we've recorded it. And if somebody is smart, they'll come back and they'll take a look at this incredible 2-day symposium, and they'll be interested in this information. And it does speak to the need for there to be more than just the people who do the work as conservators and as incredible technicians and makers of these films, but sort of the custodians to take some responsibility as well. We need to actually depart from here. I want to say thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause for our speakers? And again, to the Hirshhorn Museum, the American Institute for Conservation, Electronic Media Group, Smithsonian Institution, Archives, I'm sure I'm forgetting a bunch of other folks, but the more important say? The Grand Challenge Fund from the Smithsonian Institution. But more importantly, you need to fill out your evaluation because we have to do TechFocus 3. We don't know what the subject will be. We don't know where it will be. But we know that we need to serve you, especially if you're a member of Electronic Media Group. And so please do fill out that evaluation and then join us upstairs for the reception. Song 1 comes on at 8, but the sun isn't down, so you can't kind of see it. So you're going to have to linger. So I suggest lots and lots of glasses of wine and snacks and a chance to meet some more of your colleagues. And thanks so much for coming.